I can help write the opening section in English with a curious, emotional hook and a smooth narrative flow, but I can't imitate the exact style of a specific training document. Here's an original part 1 in a similar dramatic YouTube storytelling tone. The cruelest people are often the ones who smile the brightest before they strike. The ballroom at the Whitmore estate glittered under chandeliers so bright they made everything below them look flawless, expensive, untouchable. Waiters moved quietly between crystal glasses and silver trays, careful not to disturb the polished world of Manhattan's elite. Daniel Carter had learned how to disappear in rooms like this. At 34, he wore the black and white uniform of a catering waiter with the calm of a man who had already been judged 100 times and decided it no longer mattered. His posture was straight, his steps measured, and his attention never drifted far from the tables. He wasn't here for admiration. He was here for rent, groceries, and the kind of future that looked smaller every month but still had to be fought for. Somewhere in the back of his mind was the image of his 8-year-old son, Noah, waiting at home with a school project still half finished on the kitchen table. That thought kept Daniel steady, even when the room around him moved with the careless confidence of people who had never had to count what was left in their bank account. And then Evelyn Hart arrived. She entered like the evening had been built around her, wearing a white designer gown that caught the light with every step and a look of complete ownership over the room. She was the only daughter of Thomas Hart, one of the wealthiest men in the city, and she carried that fact as if it were a crown. Conversations softened when she passed. Men straightened their jackets. Women measured her with practiced smiles. Daniel kept his eyes down and continued toward the champagne table, but Evelyn noticed him almost instantly. It wasn't that he was trying to draw attention. It was that someone like her was used to seeing every person in the room as part of the furniture unless they had enough power to matter. Daniel set down the tray, reached for the empty glasses, and that was when Evelyn's lips curved with the kind of amusement that usually meant trouble for someone else. "You," she said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Be careful with that tray. I'd hate for you to spill something on people who can actually afford to be here." A few guests laughed nervously. Others looked away, pretending not to listen while enjoying every second of it. Daniel froze for half a beat, not because the insult surprised him, but because he recognized the tone. It was the tone of someone who had never been denied anything and assumed the world would always agree with her. He lifted his gaze just enough to meet hers, calm and unreadable, but Evelyn only smiled wider, as if his silence was proof that she had already won. At the far end of the ballroom, Thomas Hart paused mid-conversation, his expression shifting for the briefest moment into something uncertain, almost alarmed, though no one nearby noticed. Daniel didn't. Not yet. He simply took the glasses, stepped back, and kept moving through the room with the same quiet dignity he had brought in with him. But something had changed. The air around Evelyn's little joke felt thinner now, as if the room itself had started to hold its breath. Daniel had learned long ago that there were two kinds of humiliation in a room like this, the kind that burned openly, and the kind that settled quietly under the skin and stayed there. Evelyn Hart seemed determined to give him both. After the first remark, she did not stop watching him. Every time Daniel passed her table, she found another reason to look amused, another reason to make sure the people around her noticed him, as if he were something that had wandered into the ballroom by mistake. She asked for sparkling water and then for still water, then told him the temperature was wrong, even though the bottle had never left the tray long enough to warm. When he returned with a fresh glass, she tapped her nails against the stem and smiled, as if she were granting him a favor. "You really should try to look more confident," she said, tilting her head. "It makes the uniform seem less tragic." A couple seated nearby lowered their eyes into their wine glasses, clearly torn between embarrassment and curiosity. Daniel could feel the heat of their attention, but he refused to react. He set the glass down carefully, even more carefully than before, because he knew one sudden movement was all it would take for someone like Evelyn to turn this into a scene. "Would you like anything else, ma'am?" he asked, his voice steady. It was the calmness in his tone that seemed to irritate her most. Evelyn's smile thinned. "Actually, yes," she said. "Try not to get in the way." There was laughter again, softer this time, but no less cruel for it. Daniel lowered his gaze, not in shame, but in discipline. He had spent too many years learning how to survive without giving other people the satisfaction of watching him break. Before this job, before the late nights and the secondhand shoes and the constant math of bills and overdue notices, there had been other losses, other lessons. Life had taught him that dignity was sometimes the only thing a man could keep untouched. So he kept his hands steady, picked up the tray, and moved on. Still, Evelyn wasn't done. She leaned back in her chair as he passed and said, just loudly enough for the table to hear, "It's almost sweet how seriously he takes this. As if he belongs in a room with people like us." That time, one of her friends laughed outright. Another looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Daniel felt the comment land, felt the sting of it, but he did not turn around. He did not defend himself. He had a son to think about, a paycheck to protect, and a life that had already taught him the cost of pride in the wrong place. Yet somewhere across the ballroom, Thomas' heart had gone still. He was no longer listening to the man beside him. His eyes were fixed on Daniel with a strange intensity, as if he were trying to match the waiter's face to something buried deep in memory. Thomas's brows drew together, his posture changing in a subtle but unmistakable way. For a second, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man who had just heard a ghost speak his name. Daniel didn't notice the shift. He was too busy navigating the room, serving guests who treated him like part of the background, and enduring Evelyn's sharp little comments every time she found him within earshot. But the atmosphere around her table had begun to change. What had started as casual cruelty was becoming something else entirely, something heavier, as if the room itself had sensed that Evelyn had stepped too close to a truth she could not yet see. And Daniel, still unaware of the storm gathering behind him, kept doing the only thing he knew how to do: keep moving, keep quiet, and never let them see how much it hurt. By the time the main course was being served, Evelyn had grown bolder, as if Daniel's restraint had somehow encouraged her to press harder. She no longer bothered pretending her comments were private. Now she delivered them with the open satisfaction of someone who enjoyed an audience, and the room, unfortunately, was more than willing to provide one. "You missed a spot," she said, pointing at an empty place setting that was already being replaced. Then, before Daniel could answer, she added, "Or is that too advanced for you tonight?" A few people laughed. Daniel could feel the eyes on him, waiting for the usual reaction: irritation, embarrassment, maybe even anger. It would have been easy to give it to them. It would have been easy to snap back, to remind Evelyn that he was serving her food, while she had likely never learned how to do a single useful thing without a staff of assistants around her. But Daniel had spent too many nights explaining to Noah why the rent was late, and too many mornings pretending he wasn't exhausted to waste energy on a rich girl's cruelty. So he kept his face neutral, his movements precise, and his tone respectful. "I'll replace it right away, ma'am." That answer only made Evelyn smile, as if she had won a private contest no one else in the room understood. She drummed her fingers against the edge of the table and watched him move, then turned to her friends and said, "Do you know what I find fascinating? Some people really believe hard work makes them admirable." She paused, letting the words settle. "Sometimes it just makes them look tired." The group laughed again, but this time, there was a strange unevenness to it. A few guests looked down at their plates. One woman across the room frowned, as though she had gone too far, but did not know how to say it aloud. Daniel felt the familiar ache behind his ribs, not from the insult itself, but from how effortless it was for her. People like Evelyn never had to pay for their words. They threw them like coins and expected everyone else to pick them up. He set the new plate in place and stepped back. "Anything else?" he asked, still calm. "Actually," Evelyn said, folding her hands with theatrical thoughtfulness, "I'm wondering something." She looked him up and down, her expression sharpened by arrogance. "Is this job the best you can do? Or is it just temporary until your life gets sorted out?" The words landed harder than the others because they were spoken with the kind of false concern that masked cruelty beneath it. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For one brief second, the room seemed to narrow around him. He thought of Noah's backpack by the front door, of the overdue bills stacked in the drawer at home, of the promises he made every morning that tonight would be a little easier. He thought of how many times he had been treated like his struggle was a personal failure rather than a result of simply trying to survive. But he said nothing. Silence, he had learned, could be its own kind of armor. Across the ballroom, Thomas Hart had stopped pretending to listen to the conversation beside him. He was watching Daniel more carefully now, his face tense and unreadable. There was a flicker in his eyes, a deepening recognition that seemed to make him increasingly uneasy. He took a slow step away from the crowd, his attention fixed on the waiter as if Daniel had just stepped out of a memory Thomas had spent years trying to bury. Evelyn, too wrapped up in her own performance, did not notice. She was busy enjoying the small power she thought she had over him, unaware that her father's expression had changed from curiosity to something much closer to alarm. And though Daniel still did not understand why the room had begun to feel different, he could sense it now. The laughter wasn't as easy. The smiles weren't as certain, and somewhere beneath the polished surface of the evening, something hidden had begun to stir. The first person to truly notice the change in the room was Thomas Hart. He had spent decades learning how to read people in business meetings, charity galas, boardrooms, and private dinners where smiles usually concealed calculations. But this was different. This was not the subtle shift of a negotiation. This was recognition, and it had hit him so suddenly that for a moment he forgot the man speaking beside him. His eyes stayed fixed on Daniel as the waiter moved between tables, and the more Thomas watched, the more uneasy he became. It was not just the face. It was the posture, the way Daniel carried himself with quiet restraint, even while being mocked. The careful composure, the stubborn dignity. Thomas had seen that before, years ago, in a completely different life. His brows slowly pulled together. His hand tightened around the stem of his glass. And when Daniel turned slightly, the overhead light caught his profile in a way that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. No, that could not be possible. Across the ballroom, Evelyn was still speaking to her friends, still amused by her own cruelty. She had no idea that her father was no longer listening to her. She did not see the way Thomas's attention had narrowed, or how his expression had lost all trace of casual confidence. Daniel approached the table with a fresh arrangement of glasses, unaware that he had become the center of a silent storm. "Excuse me," Thomas said suddenly, his voice cutting cleanly through the soft music and scattered conversation. The table fell quiet. Even Evelyn looked up, startled by the sharpness in her father's tone. Thomas did not take his eyes off Daniel. "What is your full name?" The question landed with a strange heaviness. Daniel stopped. For a second, he simply stood there, tray in hand, reading the room with caution. It was not unusual for wealthy guests to ask personal questions with the casual entitlement of people who assumed every detail of a worker's life belonged to them. But something about the way Thomas asked made Daniel pause. There was no mockery in it, only tension. "Daniel Carter," he said at last. Thomas's face changed instantly. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone unfamiliar with him would have noticed, but enough for those close by to feel the air shift. His mouth parted slightly, his eyes sharpened, and then, very quietly, he said, "Carter." Evelyn blinked, confused by the sudden intensity of the exchange. "Dad, what is going on?" she asked, but Thomas barely seemed to hear her. He stepped closer, studying Daniel with a concentration that made the surrounding noise feel distant. "Where did you work before this?" he asked. Daniel hesitated. The question was unexpected, and the old instinct to guard himself tightened in his chest. "A few places," he said carefully. Thomas shook his head once, as if trying to clear it. "No," he said. "That's not what I mean." His voice lowered. "Tell me where you're from." The room had gone unusually still now, as though everyone had sensed the seriousness beneath the exchange. Evelyn looked from her father to Daniel, her expression shifting from irritation to confusion. Daniel, still composed but now deeply alert, sensed that something buried long ago was rising to the surface. He had no idea why his last name mattered so much to a man like Thomas Hart. But the look on Thomas's face told him this was no ordinary conversation. It was the first crack in a foundation neither of them had expected to break. And as Thomas stood there, staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and dread, it became painfully clear that Daniel Carter was not just another waiter in a black and white uniform. He was someone whose name had just unlocked a memory Thomas had spent years trying not to revisit. Daniel felt the room watching him now in a way that was completely different from before. It was no longer the casual attention given to a waiter passing between tables. This was the uneasy silence that comes when people sense something important has just cracked open in front of them. Thomas Hart had gone pale beneath the warm ballroom lights. and the change in him was impossible to miss. The man who had spent the entire evening standing like he owned the building was now holding himself like someone trying to steady a memory that had come back too fast. Carter, Thomas repeated, almost to himself, as if the name carried weight beyond the room. Daniel kept his expression controlled, but his pulse had begun to throb harder in his throat. He had no idea why this wealthy stranger was looking at him as though he had stepped out of another life. "My father's name was Michael Carter," Daniel said, choosing his words carefully. The answer seemed to hit Thomas like a physical blow. His eyes widened a fraction, and for the first time since the exchange began, he looked genuinely shaken. Around them, guests leaned subtly closer, trying to understand what had suddenly turned the evening strange. Evelyn's smile had vanished completely. She sat straight in her chair, her gaze darting between her father and the waiter she had been mocking only minutes earlier. "Dad?" she said again, this time with less annoyance and more concern. Thomas did not answer her right away. Instead, he reached for the edge of the table as though he needed something solid to hold on to. His eyes never left Daniel. "Michael Carter," he said slowly, each word measuring itself against a memory buried deep in the past. "You're his son?" Daniel frowned. He had not expected recognition, and certainly not from a man like Thomas Hart. "You knew my father?" he asked, his voice still calm, but now edged with disbelief. Thomas swallowed. The tension in his jaw was visible. "I knew him," he said quietly. "A long time ago." It was not enough to satisfy anyone, and the silence that followed only deepened the unease in the room. Evelyn stared at her father as if waiting for him to explain what was happening, but Thomas seemed caught somewhere between surprise and guilt. Daniel could feel the shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle, but powerful. The balance in the room had changed. People who had laughed a moment ago were now silent, uncertain whether they should continue pretending not to listen. Thomas took a slow breath, then asked, "Was your mother Anna Carter?" Daniel nodded once. That tiny movement seemed to unlock something in Thomas completely. His face tightened with a look that was almost painful to witness. He looked at Daniel with a new kind of focus now, not as a waiter, not as a servant in his daughter's eyes, but as a link to a chapter of life he had clearly never expected to reopen. Evelyn's confusion had now turned into open discomfort. She had no idea what name or memory stood between them, only that it was strong enough to make her father ignore her completely. Daniel, meanwhile, was beginning to realize this was not some mistaken identity. Thomas knew his family, and whatever history lay between them had been hidden long enough to matter. He had spent years believing that his name meant very little to the world beyond his son and the bills he paid each month, but now he saw Thomas Hart treating that same name like a key to something locked away for too long. The question was no longer whether Thomas recognized him. The question was why. And as Daniel stood there beneath the chandeliers, with Evelyn suddenly silent beside him, he understood that the answer was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. Thomas Hart took a long, unsteady breath, and for the first time that evening, he looked less like a powerful man and more like someone standing at the edge of a memory he had spent years avoiding. The silence around the table grew so heavy it seemed to press against the crystal glasses. Evelyn's face had gone pale, but she still had not fully understood what was happening. Daniel, however, felt it in his bones now. This was not a coincidence. Thomas knew something. Something old. Something buried. "I knew your father," Thomas said at last, his voice low and rough around the edges. "Before all of this. Before the company. Before the house. Before the name people recognized now." Daniel said nothing. He waited. He had learned long ago that the truth often revealed itself slowly, one uncomfortable sentence at a time. Thomas looked at him with a strange mixture of regret and disbelief. "Michael Carter was one of the best men I ever met," he said. "He helped me when I had nothing to give back. He saved me more than once." The words landed with visible force. Several nearby guests exchanged glances, trying to make sense of a confession that sounded more like a ghost story than a dinner conversation. Evelyn turned sharply toward her father. "Dad, what are you talking about?" she demanded, but Thomas did not answer her yet. His eyes remained on Daniel. "There was an accident," he said, swallowing hard. "Years ago. Your father disappeared from my life after that. I never found out what happened to him or your mother until much later." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, though his face remained composed. He had grown up with fragments and silences, With a mother who rarely spoke about the past, and a father who seemed to exist mostly in stories that ended before Daniel was old enough to ask questions. Hearing Thomas talk like this stirred something deep and complicated. Not anger. Not yet. More like a door opening just enough to let in a cold draft from a room he had forgotten existed. "You knew him," Daniel said quietly. It was not a question. Thomas nodded. "Yes." He looked down for a brief moment, then back up again. "And I owe him more than I ever paid." Evelyn stared, bewildered and visibly shrinking beneath the weight of the conversation. The same man she had mocked a few minutes earlier was now being spoken about by her father with respect, even guilt. She was beginning to understand that she had made a catastrophic mistake, but the realization had not yet settled fully enough to soften her expression. Around them, the ballroom had grown nearly silent. Forks hovered above plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. No one wanted to miss the moment when the powerful man in the elegant suit was forced to acknowledge the waiter he had just tried to belittle. Thomas's voice became steadier as he continued. "Your father and I had business long before the world knew my name. He was loyal, braver than I was. And when things went wrong, I let the distance grow." Daniel looked at him, trying to absorb the shape of a history he had never been told in full. The pieces were still scattered, but the outline was starting to form. He understood now why Thomas had frozen when he heard his surname, why the man's gaze had turned from curiosity to shock, then to something almost like fear. This was not just a random memory. It was personal. It was tied to debt, to loyalty, and to a chapter of Thomas Hart's life that had been left unresolved. Daniel had entered the evening as a servant in a rented uniform, invisible to everyone except the woman who had insulted him. But in that moment, the invisible walls around his identity had begun to crack. And while Evelyn stood there in stunned silence, Daniel realized the worst part was not her humiliation. It was that the truth had already started to change the way the room looked at him. For the first time that night, Evelyn Hart had nothing to say. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if the words she wanted had gotten lost somewhere between outrage and disbelief. The woman who had been smiling with cruel satisfaction only minutes earlier now looked as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. She glanced at Daniel, then at her father, and finally back at Daniel again, as if repeating the motion might somehow undo what she was seeing. It did not. Thomas's expression left no room for misunderstanding. He was not confused. He was not joking. And most importantly, he was not speaking about Daniel as if he were beneath the room anymore. The transformation was immediate and brutal in its clarity. The waiter Evelyn had mocked was no longer just the waiter. He was Michael Carter's son. He was a name Thomas Hart remembered with enough guilt to lose his composure. And suddenly, every joke Evelyn had made about his uniform, his posture, his place in the room, came back to her with a force that made her cheeks burn. But shame did not arrive gracefully. It came with a hot sting of disbelief and the desperate hope that perhaps she had misunderstood something. "Dad," Evelyn said, her voice tight now, "you're not serious." Thomas turned toward her slowly, and when he did, the last trace of his earlier authority seemed to harden into something even more dangerous: disappointment. "I've never been more serious," he said. The words landed like a verdict. Several guests looked down immediately, unwilling to witness what was becoming a public reckoning. Evelyn's friends had gone silent there earlier. Laughter evaporated so quickly it almost seemed imagined. No one wanted to be associated with the cruelty they had just watched. Daniel stood very still. He did not gloat. He did not interrupt. He had endured enough in his life to recognize that some moments do not need to be chased. They collapse under the weight of truth on their own. And that was exactly what was happening now. Thomas took a step toward him. "Daniel," he said, using the name with a respect that Evelyn had never heard her father give the man she had mocked. "You should have told me who you were." There was no accusation in his tone, only a heavy sense of failure. Daniel's answer was simple. "You never asked." That was all it took. The line was quiet, but it carried farther than a shout. Thomas absorbed it with a visible flinch. Evelyn felt it too, and this time there was no laughter left in her face to hide behind. She was now trapped in the same silence she had forced onto Daniel earlier, except that hers was filled with dread. Her father's gaze moved to her, and his disappointment sharpened. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked. Evelyn's eyes flickered. searching for an exit that did not exist. She wanted to defend herself, to say she had only been teasing, that she had not known, that none of this had been her fault. But even before she spoke, she seemed to realize how empty those excuses would sound. The room had already decided. The balance of power had already shifted. What had started as her performance of superiority was now dissolving into a scene where her humiliation was visible to everyone present. Daniel remained composed, though inside him something had begun to ache in a different way. Not because he enjoyed her shame, but because the truth had come with a strange, bitter weight. He had spent years being invisible, and now that he was seen, it was by people who had treated him as less than nothing. Thomas Hart looked at him with the expression of a man trying to make amends before it was too late. But Evelyn was the one who had to face the immediate consequence, and the realization was beginning to settle over her like a cold rain. She had not just insulted a waiter. She had insulted a man her father clearly owed more than she could comprehend. And in the stunned silence of the ballroom, that fact had become impossible to escape. The silence after Thomas's last words was almost unbearable. It stretched across the ballroom like a taut wire, fragile and dangerous, and no one dared to be the first person to speak. Evelyn remained frozen in place, her hands gripping the edge of her chair as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. For the first time in her life, she looked completely unanchored. The confidence that had carried her through the night had vanished, leaving behind only embarrassment and a dawning sense of consequence. Thomas turned fully toward her. When he spoke, his voice was firm, but there was a sadness in it that made it far worse than anger. "Apologize to him," he said. Evelyn blinked, as though she had not understood the words. "What?" Thomas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You heard me. Apologize to Daniel." Now, a few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Somewhere near the back of the room, someone set down a glass too hard, and the sharp sound seemed to echo all the way to the table. Evelyn looked at her father as if he had betrayed her, but the truth was impossible to ignore now. There was nowhere left to hide. "Dad, I didn't know," she began, desperate to build a defense out of uncertainty. Thomas cut her off with a look. "That is exactly the problem," he said. "You didn't know, and you decided it made him less than you." The words struck harder than a shout ever could. Evelyn's face flushed red, then pale again. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Daniel stood a short distance away, still holding the tray he had never set down, though it now felt absurd in his hands. He had expected disrespect tonight. He had expected condescension, maybe even cruelty. What he had not expected was to be placed in the center of a reckoning between father and daughter while the entire ballroom watched in silence. "I was only joking," Evelyn said weakly, but even she heard how fragile the excuse sounded. Thomas's expression changed, not to anger, but to something more cutting, disappointment, sharpened by love. "No," he said. "You were humiliating him." The room seemed to contract around that sentence. Evelyn's shoulders dropped a fraction. Around her, the people who had laughed before were suddenly very interested in their plates, their napkins, their drinks, anything that might keep them from being part of this. Daniel finally spoke, though his voice remained calm and low. "You don't need to force this on my account." The words were not absolution, and they were not anger. They were something more difficult, restraint. Evelyn looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time that night, she seemed to see the man behind the uniform. Not a servant, not a punchline, just a person who had endured her cruelty without giving her the satisfaction of breaking. That realization unsettled her more than any lecture from her father could have. Thomas glanced at Daniel, gratitude and regret warring in his expression. "You've shown more dignity tonight than either of us deserved," he said quietly. Daniel gave no reaction beyond a brief nod. It was enough. Evelyn swallowed hard. The apology that followed did not come easily. It was awkward, trembling, stripped of its earlier arrogance. But it came, and in that moment, the power she had spent the evening wielding like a weapon was gone. She was no longer the girl everyone watched with admiration and envy. She was simply a woman standing in front of the consequences of her behavior, made smaller not by punishment, but by the truth. The apology did not erase what had happened. It did not heal the damage instantly, but it marked the beginning of something Evelyn had never needed before, self-awareness. And as the room stayed silent around them, the lesson settled in with undeniable force. Respect could not be demanded through status. It had to be earned through character. Daniel had possessed it all night. Evelyn had only just begun to understand what she had lost. The apology changed the room, but it did not erase the night. Nothing about the ballroom felt the same after Evelyn finally forced the words out, her voice thin and unsteady, as if each syllable cost her something she had never been asked to pay before. Daniel accepted it with the same quiet composure he had carried through the whole ordeal. He did not smile. He did not savor her embarrassment. He simply nodded once, because he understood something that most of the people in that room did not. Dignity was never about making someone else smaller. It was about refusing to become smaller yourself. Thomas Hart watched him for a long moment after that, and the guilt on his face deepened into something more lasting. This was not the kind of mistake money could erase. He had watched his daughter humiliate a man who had already been carrying more than anyone in the room knew, and he had almost let the moment pass before memory forced him to intervene. That fact sat heavily between them now. "Daniel," Thomas said, his voice lower than before, "I can't undo what happened here tonight." Daniel adjusted the tray in his hands, then finally set it down on a nearby table. The gesture felt symbolic, as if he were putting away the last piece of a role he had never truly belonged to. "No," he said, "you can't." Thomas nodded, accepting the answer. "But I can make sure this doesn't end with an apology." Evelyn looked up sharply, uncertain what her father meant. For the first time, she seemed less like the owner of the room and more like a guest who had wandered into a conversation far beyond her understanding. Thomas continued, his gaze still on Daniel. "Whatever history my family owes yours, I intend to find out what it was and settle it properly." The statement carried weight, but Daniel didn't seize on it. He had spent too many years learning not to trust promises made in expensive rooms. Still, there was no hostility in Thomas's voice now, only an uneasy sincerity. Daniel glanced toward the ballroom's large windows, where the city lights glittered against the dark like distant reminders that life outside this evening was still moving, still waiting. Somewhere beyond all of this, Noah was probably asleep by now, unaware that his father had just stood in a room full of people and survived being humiliated by grace alone. That thought steadied Daniel more than anything else. He had not come to this place for revenge. He had come to earn an honest night's work. And in the end, he had done more than that. He had forced a room full of strangers to see him, not as someone beneath them, but as a man whose name still carried a past powerful enough to shake one of the wealthiest families in the city. Evelyn remained silent, the color returning slowly to her face, though not to her pride. She understood now that the evening had changed her in a way she had not anticipated. She would remember the look in her father's eyes long after the chandeliers dimmed. She would remember the moment the waiter she dismissed became the man her family had once owed something too important to forget. And Daniel, for his part, would remember something else, that sometimes the truth does not arrive with triumph. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a room full of people who never expected to be wrong. He left the ballroom with his head high, not because he had won, but because he had never needed to fight dirty to prove who he was. Behind him, the laughter was gone, the arrogance had cracked, and the evening had turned into something none of them would forget. Not because of the humiliation, but because of the reckoning. And in that reckoning, Daniel Carter walked out not as a waiter who had been put in his place, but as a father, a son, and a man whose name had finally been heard.